Jerome Powell, the chair of the Federal Reserve, delivered remarks after the Fed decided to keep interest rates where they are and not lower them. And in talking about the state of the economy, Jerome had a few interesting things to say. Some stuff that I don't think Trump's going to like to hear, which is, and he tries to do it in the least partisan way possible, but it was a lot of, things were looking really good, and then something happened, and now we feel like it's less good, is maybe how I would sum it up from Jerome. So let's listen to some of these clips. This is on the topic of price stability, and he says, I think we are really getting to a place of a healthy economic environment for price stability. And then something happened. If you appreciate the show, please do click the subscribe button.
I think a world where people can make their daily economic decisions in businesses and they're not having to think about the possibility of significantly high inflation. We know inflation will bounce around. That is price stability. I think we were getting closer and closer to that. I wouldn't say we were at that. Inflation was running around 2.5% for some time. I do think with the arrival of the tariff inflation, further progress may be delayed. The SEP doesn't really show further downward progress on inflation this year, and that's really due to the tariffs coming in. I think. Right.
That there's very likely going to be an angry Truth Social post from Trump at some point about this. This is part of the reason that Trump said he kind of wants to take control of the Fed, which would be bad, very, very bad. But that he makes better judgments on such things than the experts. At another moment, Powell referenced the same little shift in circumstances that now makes the economic outlook a little less positive.
Economic activity continued to expand at a solid pace in the fourth quarter of last year, with GDP rising at 2.3%. Recent indications, however, point to a moderation in consumer spending following the rapid growth seen over the second half of 2024. Surveys of households and businesses point to heightened uncertainty about the economic outlook. It remains to be seen how these developments might affect future spending and investment.
Aaron Rupar, in response to this, said, geez, what happened after the fourth quarter of last year to make the economy shittier? And it's a really tough one to figure out. So fourth quarter last year, okay. Now we're in the first quarter of this year. Things were looking strong. Now there's more economic uncertainty. What was, and I'm being a little silly because he did name tariffs specifically, but it's even more than that. With the dismantling of government institutions, that wildly impacts the private sector. With grants being cut off, that wildly impacts the private sector. And tons of people now losing their jobs. That's changing the job market, that because of the layoffs of federal workers. Yes, the trade wars, not just the exact policy, but the broader confusion of the implementation and the on and the off and on and the off and on. And all of that is taking what fundamentally was a steady, strong economy with the underlying issues that are there of inequality and the massive problems we want to address through comprehensive policy. But the nuts and bolts of it, strong. And then a wrench was thrown into that. Obviously, it's Trump. A reporter even asked Jerome Powell about this.
How much of the higher inflation forecast for this year is due to tariffs? And since the policy path remains the same, are you effectively reading this as a one-time price level shock?
Okay, so how much of it is tariff? So let me say that it is going to be very difficult to have a precise assessment of how much of inflation is coming from tariffs and from other, and that's already the case. You may have seen that goods inflation moved up pretty significantly in the first 2 months of the year. Trying to track that back to actual tariff increases, given what was tariffed and what was not, very, very challenging. So some of it, the answer is clearly some of it. A good part of it is coming from tariffs, but we'll be working, and so will other forecasters, to try to find the best possible way to separate non-tariff inflation from tariff inflation.
So as we've discussed, the Fed did a pretty good job post-pandemic of handling that soft landing. and the combination of the congressional leaders and Biden administration leaders, and then definitely the Federal Reserve, all of that ended up combining to have a soft landing, jolting out of the economic downturn because of the pandemic, but then in trying to pull back after that jolt, not pulling us into a recession. And so what's going to happen is that Jerome Powell and the Fed is going to be trying to manage the whims of Trump's policies and then reacting to the economic outcomes of that to best minimize the pain, which is interesting because Trump's going to have a lot of heat for someone like Powell because he would acknowledge the fact of the different truths of the economic policies of Trump, sort of vaguely. But Powell's going to be just trying to minimize the negative impacts of Trump's policy, again, as he sees the effect of them ripple across the economy. Then it looks like from the previously forecasted GDP growth for Q1, right now they're predicting something less.
In our summary of economic projections, the median participant projects GDP to rise 1.7% this year, somewhat lower than projected in December, and to rise a bit below 2% over the next 2 years.
Okay, and that was for the year, not Q1. So that's potentially even worse, which is to say that from the entirety of 2025, we're seeing an adjustment in how strong and how much growth will be taking place in the economy. And what changed from December to now March in that forecast, we know. We know, and that is the orange man and his economic illiteracy. One little miscellaneous story I wanted to update you on. New York Times report, NASA astronauts' 9-month orbital odyssey ends in a splashdown. Suni Williams and Butch Wilmore finally made it home to Earth after a 17-hour trip aboard a SpaceX capsule. Now, what you're hearing, I'm glad they're home. Hooray. What you're hearing, though, from Trump and from Elon and from MAGA is that Biden left them up in space. He abandoned them, and then it took Elon heroically coming in to save them. Here is Scott Kelly on Fox News fact-checking that.
Mental side to it, too.
Hague, Butch Wilmore.
Brett, before I talk about that, let me say something. I was watching the previous, your previous program, The Five, and they're talking about abandoned and they were stranded by President Biden. That is not true. They have had a spacecraft up there since September that was going to bring them home. They've always had a ride home, and the decision to keep them up there had nothing to do with politics. It was just the fact that you need crew members to operate the space station, and they were the two that were there, and you had to send up a vehicle with 2 empty seats. So the safest thing to do was to just leave them there. But they weren't stranded. They always had a ride home. Now,
yeah, and this is something that we already debunked and that the astronauts themselves have debunked. So good on SpaceX for maybe, I mean, unless it was just an inefficient way. But if it did make it better or whatever, I'm happy they're home. Yay. And that's sort of the simple response. But the Biden stranded them, or the only way they could get back is if Elon was a genius, or any of the other things we've heard. It's been debunked by them, the astronauts themselves, and by this show and so many others. Again, everything has to be politicized. But it's a good example of, by the way, SpaceX really, when it comes to the private space exploration industry, it is dominant for sure. And it's interesting because I'll hear from MAGA often, how can you dislike Elon if Tesla exists or if SpaceX exists? And not to use too provocative of an example, and this is not a perfect analogy, but I could, for example, enjoy a Volkswagen and not like Hitler. Not the perfect analogy, but you see the through line, and I'm not just saying to demonstrate a principle. It's not even an analogy, it's just a principle exploration. And so similarly here, I see some of the positives of companies that he bought or that he ran, and then I see negatives in some like Twitter. And then when I look at his political, is sort of what is the net effect of someone, and his net effect in his governance and the role he's been given because he gave investments to the Trump campaign to the tune of $100 million is just making a horrible net bad of his legacy, of his presence on the scene. But good that the astronauts are back, bad for the politicization by MAGA. Share your thoughts in the comments.